1 d4 and wanted to try the interesting variation against Fischer's King's Indian defence with the bishop d2, which is kind of referred to as the cautionary variation against the King's Indian defence. So we have knight f6, we go into the King's Indian defence, where black is allowing white to set up the centre, d6, knight f3, so this is the classical variation, e5, white castles, knight c6, this is all pretty standard stuff in the King's Indian, one of the most popular variations of the King's Indian defence. But now this bishop d2 move on move 9. So this was first seen in a blitz game, cautionary against Fischer, which actually Fischer won. But so how would it fare in this game? Fischer first retreated his knight, knight e8. Let's put on a kibitzer here. So knight e8 is a fairly standard idea in this opening, that you want to get your f pawn ready to go. And sometimes you might play h6 before f5, but here, after rook c1, white is pretty quick for trying for this c5 break. These kind of positions really teach about pawn chain strategy, where white's trying to undermine black at the most exploitable point of the pawn chain, d6. Although this is the base, often c5 to try and weaken this pawn chain here. And black is often playing on the king side with f5 to get some counterplay there. And we see an immediate f5 in this position, not minding about knight g5. So here actually, instead of knight g5 though, that might be an interesting move, queen b3, making c5 more effective. Although it's blocking the b pawn, this c5, this diagonal, has to be dealt with. It's also tying down the bishop to b7. We see now b6, trying to discourage c5. Now white took on f5. Now usually players with black don't want to take with a piece here, because often that e4 square is really quite useful. Like every Russian schoolboy quotations around the knight on e4, you don't want to have this position because you've got this bishop hemmed in. This is a very nice blockade square. White could have a very strong grip on the position here. No, black usually wants to take with a pawn as a general principle. He's got that g file potentially, the bishop potentially with e4 is more liberated. But the downside has been tested here by black, namely this e6 square that black hasn't taken time out to play that h6 earlier, and so why not knight g5? So this happened, knight g5. Is black worried? Well, actually Fischer plays knight f6 now. Okay, and yes, let's see this position. If white immediately played knight e6, well, he didn't. He actually played f4, but let's have a look. Knight e6. Maybe this is okay for white as well as the game continuation. Something like this is interesting. This position is quite interesting. There might be some pressure on d6 later. But okay, the knight didn't go in to e6, just f4. Trying perhaps to fix black's pawns. And you can imagine a good blockade on e3, for example, might be possible. If black played like a routine looking move, e4, then maybe white can consider in the future some sort of blockade on e3, and maybe bring this knight back to f2 if needed, if it was kicked. So Fischer keeps things fluid actually, though, with these pawns for the moment. He actually kicks the knight. White is not obliged to move back the knight though. The knight could go in here as well, but white actually decided to play f takes e5, which increases the mobility of these pawns actually after d takes e5. Let's just imagine if d takes e5 wasn't played. H takes, I think this would be better for white. E takes, bishop takes. This position here should be okay for white. Something like this. Say black wanted to go for the attack. Well, he's always down to these pawns, so it'd be difficult to kind of use that h-file. This position might be favourable for white. So actually we see just d takes, which, okay, it seems that this pawn is more mobile now. Maybe this one and this one, and this queen would be perfectly justified. Yeah, in fact, now a surprising move based on this idea that these pawns are mobile and this queen's, you know, sitting on b3. White now ignores the g5 knight being attacked and plays c5. So ignoring this because of this d6 idea. So this looks like a dangerous initiative from white here. How does Fischer deal with this? Let's imagine, okay, let's see what happens on h takes g. This wasn't played in the game. Actually, this was played, which I think Kasparov has given an exclamation mark in his own comments on this game. So Fischer had to deal with this over the board. If he had played h takes g, I think there's some strong moves available for white. If we just check d6 check to get the piece back, this position here seems pleasant enough for white. Say bishop e6, bishop takes g5. I don't know, it's an interesting position. Okay, I think sorry, but queen takes e5 on here. If we move the pawn, yeah, it's okay. It's okay. But okay, so this position here, this looks like a difficult tactical position. Another alternative, I mean, if we move the king, then again d6 might be interesting. So Fischer actually, what he did, he actually played probably one of the strongest moves in this position. He played knight f takes d5, taking out that centre pawn. And after the knight takes, again, this knight didn't move. If the knight goes back, let's imagine the knight going back, then something like e4, this would be fine for black. No big problems there. There's always bishop e6 to bishop c4 or c6. I think both these moves are okay. So the knight doesn't want to go back yet. C takes b was played, and some more interesting possibilities now. What is going on here? If h takes, then this is actually quite dangerous for black. Black can play a very interesting tactical move here. The obvious move is also looking good, just taking here. There's a lot of pawns and pressure here facing black, you know, like bishop c5, that pinned knight. And also the computer suggesting something quite interesting here in this position. That actually, sorry, if h takes g, in this position, rook c6 apparently, with the idea of bishop c4, it's cutting off bishop e6 as a defense. So it takes, you know, bishop c4, and this is good for white. So there's some interesting possibilities, but yeah, Fischer didn't take this knight, he left that knight. Again, maybe his tactical concerns, he appreciated some of the tactical concerns in this position, like this idea of rook c6 and bishop c4. Okay, so yeah, he just played a takes b, and now rook c6 was played, so it does cut off that bishop e6. So again, this idea of bishop c4 without bishop e6, offering that knight. And now another very, very strong move in the circumstance, getting out of the pin. We see that expression, pin and win. Again, taking here, this is just going to be good for white, bishop c4. This, you know, for example, this position is starting to be unpleasant. White gets the stuff he kind of wants. He's got Attacks all over the place. He's got a dangerous attack here on the king side. Fischer sidesteps this stuff. He just plays king h8. So the knight is ready to move actually to things like places like f4. It's unpinned. And now this is a key moment where white sank into fort. So his knight had not been taken. And in fact, the pawn in this position, which is looked at by the rook, can actually be double attacked and pinned. And this is a move I think that Mike Taimanov took a long time over. Maybe too long. His time management for the game might not have been ideal, but he wanted to get back in the match. You know, he was two games down, six game match, and I believe he spent a long time over queen h3. Well, in his own notes, this move queen h3. But is it actually very dangerous for black? Initially, it does look very dangerous. There's actually a false mate in 3 threatened with taking here, and then rook h8. Just to demonstrate that, just give a token move here. Takes this is what has to be dealt with. Check, and then mate. So this is looking like a dangerous move. Just shifting the queen over queen h3. We can analyse it a bit here. Rook f6 might be a good defensive try. And say check to deflect the rook away from h6. Bishop takes. It looks dangerous, but it seems black might be okay here. For example, bishop f6. And if the attack is not leading to anything concrete, it's difficult to see. Yeah, how is this winning for white? In fact, black starts attacking the attacking pieces. Yeah, I mean, some precision defense would be needed, but it seems as though this sort of position is okay. This is idea bishop b7 here to relieve the pressure. If here, then this rook can actually be quite dangerous. So I think maybe it is good to try and take out this attacking piece, and black should be fine. But yeah, a lot of time was spent analysing queen h3 apparently during the game, and it was rejected. This is like a critical moment of the match, a critical key moment of the match. It's interesting, you know, that knight was just left there, not taken for several moves. Sorry, there's a question on stream. Doesn't it take one more move, just simply moving the queen though? Yeah, I mean, rook takes h6 is threatened. I mean, there's other defensive tries as well. Knight f6. This doesn't seem entirely clear as well, as though it's winning for white or not. But yeah, rook f6 or knight f6 seem like viable defensive tries. Okay, but white retreats his knight, and it's a symbol, this retreat, of kind of, yeah, accepting a potentially, you know, black coming out of this. His king's not going to be as attacked now. Unless, you know, there's an idea sometimes of getting to use the g6 square. At the moment it's unlikely, the knight's covering. So I don't know what the concrete threats are, except though bishop takes h6 is on. Okay, so bishop takes h6 is one threat, and maybe bishop c4 is useful. So in dealing with these, Fischer actually kicked that rook, bishop b7. It goes to g6. Okay, and now the rook is attacked again, and this coordination is broken, just at the cost of having double pawns with knight f4. So blocking the bishop attacking h6. And also, of course, you know, the dark square bishop is a great trump card for black to have if bishop takes f4. But what else to suggest for white? Can the knight really be tolerated there? It's hitting the rook. Doesn't it have to be taken out? Where does the rook go? I mean, this is awkward. The knight is hitting the bishop. We can't go back here. We can just take here. So bishop takes f4, and of course now if we look at this position, there's double pawns, but the king is quite safe now. This dark square bishop is potentially dangerous. White hasn't got a dark square bishop. And these bishops are actually cross-firing here. Look at these cross-fire bishops on the diagonals. So let's see how it goes now. Rook d1, queen e7. Keeping an eye on that that h4 square. Rook e6. Also, that had to be dealt with. But now check. The king goes to f1. This is already a very tricky position here. If king h1, apparently black's got quite a sizable advantage here technically. For example, just challenging on the d file, that there's some potential back row issues emerging. This doesn't look too pleasant for white. So anyway, the king went towards the centre here. That might be the best move, technically. It keeps control of the f2 square as well, in case the queen wants to go into f2. But now this central challenge, rook a d8. This rook doesn't feel as though it's quite right. And black is also potentially now going to victimize that rook with bishop d5. So bishop d5 is in the air here as well, among other things. So even like taking and then bishop c8, where is the rook going? To g6, then king h7. So this rook is not totally ideal in this position. White plays rook takes d8. After rook takes d8, yeah, black's bishops just eyeing the diagonals again. It looks like a very coordinated position. And if you look at black's central control here, it's very impressive. I don't know how many of you looking at this think black's really kind of dominating the position actually, because this rook doesn't seem that great on e6 here. It hasn't got any backup. This bishop's quite passive on e2. So let's see what happened. Queen a4 was played. Looking at taking here, perhaps, and also supporting rook e8 check, at least doing something with that rook. But it's Fischer's turn now. He throws this check in, queen c1. And now things are getting really quite tricky. King f2 was played. This is a very difficult position. You don't really want the king on the dark squares when there's a dark square bishop around. You know, there's possibilities like this. But if after this check knight e1 was played, then in fact there's another danger here coming up with rook g8. You know, the bishop and rook are potentially coordinating for things like this. Bishop takes g2. For example, say here, bishop takes g2, queen takes e1, and also that g-file attack. So it's a pretty dangerous position already after this queen c1 check. It seems a moment has passed and black seems to have, you know, some dangerous trump cards to attack with, namely the bishop pair. And this bishop is in particular the danger man of the position, I would say. And it's used now, bishop f8. If we can get on that delicious diagonal with bishop c5, it looks to be pretty much over for white's king safety. So white has to prevent bishop c5 check. He plays b4. Okay, so after b4 we see bishop e4, and this provides quite a few interesting possibilities now. For example, c6 could shut down this diagonal now that the bishop's in the opponent's territory. It's very useful. Okay, so we have rook e8 though, and Fischer reacts to this fantastically in this position. A fantastic little tactic. So maybe white had been banking on this move, rescuing his rook, but there really is a crushing move played in this position, a computer-like move. If I give you 20 seconds, what would you play as black? Black to play here. So black to play, 20 seconds, what would you play as black? b5 was mentioned by Bush. No, it's not Bush, Lorenz. It's not b5. We can have a quick look at b5. I'm just taking here. Should be okay for white. It's not b5. Any thoughts? Well, sorry, if you say with c6, now here there's queen e5 check. So it's not that. Any ideas on stream? Okay. Sorry. In this position, there's the really crushing move. Bishop c6. Yeah. Ouch. Oh dear. Oh dear. Attacking the queen and the rook. So the rook hadn't escaped. It's basically lost. It's like this is a sad game. White had this one moment of opportunity with the queen h3. He was driven back, and black had the dangerous bishop here. And now he seems to have just blundered with this rook e8. He has to give up his queen. He's just losing the rook. He loses his queen with queen takes c6. I mean, he gives up his queen for 2 pieces. It's not enough, this position. This is at move 32. And before we go beyond this point at move 32, let's have a look. Was this rook e8 an encouraged blunder? It's difficult to suggest what white does in this position here. Say queen b3, c6. And black's got a lot of things going on here, including threats like rook d3 is crushing. For example, here, rook d3, if we take, check, bishop takes d3, this sort of stuff is crushing. So it seemed to be, let's appreciate it was a difficult position before this rook e8 move. The engine's giving this as nearly like more than 2 units up for black. Queen b5 as an example, bishop d5. And we can actually just maybe nab this pawn here even. And if it takes here, there's always the check. That's dangerous. So yeah, black seems to be doing very well, but I guess, you know, it didn't really help to play this rook e8. It made the bad position even worse. So bishop c6, falling into a little trap. So yeah, he's on the verge of being 3 points down now in this 6-game match. Queen f6 hitting the rook, protecting the bishop. Let's see the game continuation. Queen e7 going into that e3 square now is very, very juicy. Or just taking the pawn. King f1. King h7 unpinning the bishop. Knight d4. Now the bishop moves because it's been unpinned to g7. I don't think there's any time for knight takes f5. Knight b5 was played. If knight takes f5, queen d7, we got another fork. That's the last thing black would need. So yeah, we see knight b5, and the bishop now protects c7 along with the queen. So there's no problem with c7 here. a3. Now eviction to the rook. Now black plays f3, getting rid of his double pawns and getting a pawn which might affect white's king safety again. Also, bishop takes f3 is out of the question because a queen takes b5. So g takes, it's forced actually. Bishop takes h2. And with this, the g1 square lights up, so there's possibilities like here. Now looking at g1. King g2. And in fact, an ingenious move in this position, queen g7 check, offering the bishop. King takes for queen e5 check, getting the bishop back. king g1. And I think the game was adjourned at move 42. So, and this is really interesting. So they started game 4 with this position adjourned. I don't know, maybe Martin should have just resigned it, but it's like match chances were fading. So they go into game 4, but and a deal was offered to resign this game so the other game could be drawn, but Fischer turned that deal down. Obviously he knew he was winning this. You know, there's no point in adjourning this sort of position. It's completely lost. You know, after queen takes e2, there's nothing really white. So it was. Sorry, I might be getting the adjournment wrong. Oh dear, sorry. The game had been adjourned earlier, but the story still holds. A deal was trying to be made that it was resigned earlier from this, but Fischer had played it on and he won. I'm not entirely sure what move the adjournment was in this game. It might have been about move 30, I suspect, or 35. But here, yeah, this is a clearly lost position. You wouldn't adjourn this position, sorry. Does anyone know about the adjournment details? Or maybe post it on the comments on the video when it goes on YouTube. Adjournment details will be interesting to know. But here, yeah, it is completely like losing. We just take here. We're hitting that knight. If knight takes c7, the queen is more than a match for the two pieces. Like we're winning the knight like this, you know, for example. Yeah. So okay, yeah. So we look at this game as a whole, but yeah, it was in two phases. There wasn't a adjournment, and then Fischer went on to win it. So the key moment, the key critical moment, this cautionary variation had been repeated with this bishop d2, which so white's trying to get in this fast rook c1 with a queen b3, and these all sorts of really weird tactical ideas with knight g5 later. And it just didn't seem to work out. It seems Fischer refuted the whole thing over the board. This idea of that knight hanging on g5 for such a long time after h6. You know, we get this quite a long in-between sequence of taking c5, all this knight hanging on g5, so taking an in-between move, another in-between move, now for d6, which of course justifies the queen. But now this knight f takes d5, this might be one of the best moves in the position. It's the engine choice, actually. There might even be, like, technically, you might think the other knight, will the other knight do, but actually knight f3, there's some big differences here in the position, which might make this inferior as a version. You might not think what's the big deal, but you know, things like knight takes f5 here, that's good for white. So yeah, taking with the f knight was a key decision which Fischer came to over the board. If we look at this variation again with knight f3, knight takes d5 was played. If knight f3 here, e4, this is actually working out a lot better because this f pawn is not a problem. For example, knight takes, we just take that. So that was a key decision, which knight to take on d5 here. This is the right one. We've got the f pawn covered. So, and then again with this knight hanging, so knight takes, c takes. This is other things going on. Just a takes, just calmly waiting for this knight to go back. And when it did go back, you know, rook c6 now. Just king h8, unpinning this guy. Again, taking here is inaccurate, it seems, because the bishop c4, and white would end up better. So Fischer's sidestepping all this tactical pressure, but this is the moment, you know, queen h3 maybe should have been played. Just a practical try. It seems when white started retreating, he just collapsed from this position. After the knight f3, he just started to collapse. It seems this rook is a tactical target to get tempos off on c6, and for black to, you know, eventually dominate the position with the bishop pair. Looking at these two diagonals, the way the game evolved here, yeah, the rook seems like it was exploited immediately for this knight f4. Black getting that bishop pair, and it just seems like Black's in the driving seat here, with a very dangerous position already, challenging that central file. It's got all these pieces directed towards the centre with the bishop pair and the dangerous dark square bishop. The double pawns are really insignificant in the scheme of the other things here. So yeah, White's just collapsing here, it seems. And yeah, he made this blunder which made things worse, this rook e8. In this position, rook e8, it made things a lot worse, but this is a very, very difficult position. Engine valuation is above 2 for Black. So, I don't know, Fischer seems to have refuted this whole innovation idea, this concept of knight g5, just totally over the board. So yeah, going in effect 3 points up with this, but it was in 2 parts, as I say, in the German part of this game and then resume later. So we'll go on to game 4 now. Okay, so I don't know, I hope you got something out of this game. So game 4 now we're going to look at. So Fischer White in game 4. He plays e4. So game 3 adjourns, actually. Back of the mind though, he probably thinks he's winning that. Knight c6, d4. So this position, which is, funny enough, a Sicilian Taimanov, named after Taimanov, his opponent. This is a Sicilian Taimanov. Okay, knight c3, e6, g3, a6, bishop g2, knight f6, white castles, and we have knight takes d4, queen takes. This is well-known position in live book. There's over 380 games here with bishop c5, well-known opening territory. Bishop f4, well-known response. Queen drops back. This is all well-known so far. h6. Rook ad1, prompting Black to do something about the d6 pawn with e5. Bishop drops back. Now, quite popular is bishop e6. This is also quite popular, what was played, bishop g4. And White doesn't play a move like f3. It's not needed here. f3, Black might be doing fine with bishop e6. And Black has succeeded in weakening that diagonal. Now, a much stronger move here, it seems. Bishop takes c5 was played, and we're coming out of book here. Let's have a look now. The first thing to note, well, if bishop takes d1, we just take on d6. That's no good. Getting lots of material. So, bishop takes c5. Black takes with the queen to get rid of his backward pawn. And now we have f3. Bishop e6. And White's got a small advantage here, it seems. f4 from the opening. He can't be displeased with the opening so far. Rook d8. And here, yeah, instead of, well, what do we do with the queen in this position? I don't think this would be too clever. I mean, it's potentially asking for trouble, but actually a strong move, just knight d5, why not? It changes the imbalances of the position quite significantly. It's fixing the hole for Black, kind of, but it's getting that light square bishop. And you'll see this is very important for this game, this consideration here, this configuration that we have, the bishop against the knight. Watch out for that now for the course of the game. Now, immediately things like f takes and d6 are threatened. Black plays e4. And here, perhaps white could simply play c4. That seems okay enough for a small advantage. So another sharp move though was tried here. Rook f e1. That's interesting. Maybe the engine choice is actually c4. I don't know why this is seen as stronger. Maybe this pawn is slightly vulnerable. This position here, it seems the e4 pawn might be vulnerable. So this is a very interesting alternative, perhaps, to the game continuation, where white can target e4 and maybe take it here. Maybe Fischer gave some consideration to c4, but okay, he plays this move instead. Rook f e1, and it allows rook takes d5, and white's relying on this little tactic, rook takes e4 check here, so that if knight takes, we have queen takes d5 with a fantastic position. This would be absolutely fantastic with the king still in the center. This would be really miserable for black, and losing b7. No, black can't do that. But he can play what seems to be a bit outrageous. He plays king d8, but the king is only one step away from like the queen side. You might not think, is it that big deal? If the king had gone to f8, then actually there's a very nice tactic for white in rook e8 check, exposing, bishop takes d5, and here white's a lot better after bishop takes d5. But yeah, king d8 is the right move to play, it seems, after this check. King d8. Now we have queen e2, and white's got a small advantage in this position. Rook takes d1, queen takes d1, queen d7, and we're simplifying rapidly to an endgame configuration of rook and bishop against rook and knight. Queens come off. Rook e5. This tries to prompt, b6. With b6, of course, these light squares are getting a bit weaker, well, especially c6. But b6 is played in this position. If something like this, then we have the nasty bishop h3 check. And if c4, I don't think that helps. Well, we just take here. So I think b6 was virtually forced here, nearly forced. There's another possibility, maybe king d6 is possible. That's possible, maybe, because things might get tricky after this. So that was something to be considered as well. Then king d6. But yeah, the more committal b6 perhaps is slightly less accurate. Possibly is less accurate. But who would know the torture levels that would be put on black from this position? So at move 24, how can white torture black? Well, the first thing he does is make the bishop, trying to provoke some other weaknesses. So on b5 it ends c6 now. If b5, then we just take on c5 without much penalty. And if rook a8, then in this position bishop c4 might be good, attacking f7. So yeah, black committed to a5, so he's weakening the colour complex, the light squares. You could argue, of course, the pawns are away from the light square bishop, so if there's less targets for the bishop, that's a good thing. But I think there's a fantastic strategy here to do with pawns and bishops and kings, that basically white would like to use the weakened light squares to put his king over here, maybe to infiltrate. He'd like to use these pawns, if they were fixed, to attack with the bishop. That's the general plan. Use the king on the queen side, the bishop on the king side. And we see this evolving, this plan evolving. Bishop c4 starting to attack the king side pawns. And the king is starting to be brought over gradually to the queen side. Knight d7. Okay. Check. c3, which cuts out things like the d4 square now from that knight. But the king is starting to make its way to b5 later, believe it or not. King d6, a4, fixing totally now these pawns. Knight e7, h3, h4, h5. Now this is a target. You see, if these pawns are all a target to the light square bishop later, even if it was like this configuration, they'd all be on light squares. That'd be a feast for the bishop potentially. Now, if black hadn't played h5, and that's not an engine suggestion h5, I'm not sure. You know, maybe g4. It starts a bit uncomfortable. You know, with g4, g5 later. So maybe black, you know, he wanted to fix things, but he's putting his pawns on light squares. So as I say, the king wants to be on the queen side to exploit the holes on the light squares. The bishop wants to make a feast of the pawns on the light squares on the king's side. Check, rook d5, hitting h5, forcing another pawn potentially on the light square, either this one or this one. f5. Remember, this is a feast for the bishop potentially, especially if g6 later is forced. So making slow progress here, getting this configuration where the king now is trying to come to the queen side. See this king wants to come over here. See this bishop wants to eat these pawns. Rook d3, and now the rooks come off. We still have that basic plan. The bishop wants to attack the pawns, the king wants to go to b5. King d3, knight e7, bishop e8. So the bishop's now pinning down the knight, so defending these pawns for a moment. King d5, stopping king c4 as well for the moment, but check. White's going to force his way to b5. King c4, he's coming into b5 to put pressure on these pawns on dark squares. The king's going to attack the pawns on the dark squares, the bishop's going to attack the pawns on the light squares. Is black getting overloaded? King c6, check. Force the king into b5. King b7, king b5. The knight's tied down now, really, to g6. The king is starting to be tied down to the dark squares. Knight c8. Threatening knight d6 check. Nuisance. Check. Bishop d5. Not worried about king a6 being needed. If knight d6, I mean the a6 square can be used here. King a6 and black's in meltdown here. It's going to be zugzwanged because the knight is getting the king is tied down to b6, and the knight can't hold f7. You know, if knight c8 then bishop f7, black will be in meltdown. So black wasn't interested in knight d6 check here. He played knight e7. Bishop f7. So we got pressure on both sides of the boards here. These pawns, both sides of the board. The knight hasn't got opportunities. King b7. But how to make progress here? This seems optimal, doesn't it? Isn't the pressure optimal? We've got pressure on both structures. How does white proceed here? There's a fantastic rerouting move now, which is played at move 54. What would you play here? White play. So move 54. How does white extend the pressure now from this position? He seems to have his pieces in optimal places. Or does the king want to go further into the position? So 20 seconds here. White to play. What would you play here? Would we just agree a draw here? Or is there a way of increasing the pressure? Fischer's move is actually one of the top engine moves as well. No, the king's in an optimal place. The king is optimally placed. Actually on b5 for the moment. I think bishop e8 really cuts it. If bishop e8, I think black can just play this, apparently knight c8, and actually that's a nuisance again. You've got to think, where does the bishop want to be? Oh, this endgame pressure separates Fischer from loads of people, grandmasters probably. He plays bishop b3. Yes, he wants to reroute like this. Bishop b3. King a7. Bishop d1. So what's the point of the bishop being here? Well, now he wants to get into a6 on king c7. In fact, black allows that. That king a6. But why? Why did black allow that? If king a7 had been played, this position has bishop c6, and black's getting into a zugzwang here. You know, if takes this is hopelessly lost, this king and pawn ending. And if knight c8, bishop d5, simultaneously threatens king c6 and other things, not bishop f7 because of the knight d6 chain. Got to be careful about the pesky knight. But king c6 and other things are being threatened. And it's difficult for black to do something about this. He can't play here now. He can't stop king c6. If knight e7, then in this position, apparently c4 is a pretty strong move. That's just, so the king's eventually going into c6. So yeah, this is a crushing maneuver. It seems after this check, black decided to give up the a6 square. Yeah, it doesn't look too good, this position. You know, the king's tied down to b6. It doesn't look good, this position. And black's eventually being run out of moves. If you play knight g8, bishop d5, knight f6, bishop f7, it starts to fall to pieces, g6, going. So yeah, after the check, black concedes the a6 square. So king a6. So is black being forced into zugzwang? Knight c8, and the bishop just moves now to d5, threatening things potentially against this pawn chain, potentially. Knight e7, bishop c4, so waiting around for bishop f7, knight c6, and now bishop f7, knight e7, now bishop e8. And this is the moment, guys, where the queen side pressure and the king side pressure again seem at an optimal point. And black in zugzwang can't move the king without losing b6, can't move the knight without losing g6. And what he does seems to solve the problem, doesn't it? King d8. Because surely he'll get time for returning to c7 here. But guess what? Guess what? This is move 62. What does Fischer play here? 20 seconds. White to play. What would you play here? Okay. Any ideas? We're reaching a climax of the position. Our queen side pressure and our king side pressure. And if we just, you know, if we just went back here, then just here, and we haven't proven anything. Yeah? So, Fischer plays actually bishop takes g6. Wow. It's forcing black knight takes g6, but now we're going to munch these pawns. 2 pawns for the piece, 3 pawns for the piece. Can the knight cope with 2 connected passed pawns after b4? That's an interesting little test for the knight. b4, So we've got our two connected passed pawns now. Also, of course, our king is in quite an aggressive place. If it goes over here, these guys are going to be taken. It's a pretty hopeless position here. A5, B5. Now this is important here after 94, it seems, that you have to have the right move here. If, well, what would you play? I'm not going to say anything more. White's play here has to play the right move, it seems. Otherwise, it could be risking equality. What is the right move for White after this check? What would you do with the king? Anyone? Right. The right move, it seems, is king b6. Now, if you played king d4, king c7 is the problem, not taking on g3, king c7. And then it seems as though, like, say this position, it seems as though black might be able to hold, because actually the knight here is actually holding f5 and h5. And it might be difficult to make progress here. I mean, we could try going over here, but I'm not entirely sure. In this position, black doesn't have to concede any square. Black here can actually play check and go back to g3. So black could set up a fortress on that small inaccuracy. Well, large inaccuracy. It seems black could set up a drawing position. It's equal apparently. So yeah, it's important to play king b6 here. This is the winning idea, king b6. Again, also of course, we can rule out here, again this idea repeats, that we just get a blockade here and we just take the same sort of thing, yeah? So king b6 stops any blockade of the black king against these pawns. The king wants to shepherd the pawns. A good shepherd stopping the black king getting in the way. King c8. And we have an opposition set up, king c6. Okay, so this position is interesting. You might think, okay, what does black do here? If he took on g3, well, he played king b8. If he takes on g3, a6, and then here, we've got b6, yeah, and if here, we can play check, and check, and king c7, and we're queening with check. So that would be winning against that knight there. So yes, very dangerous position. So after king c6, black didn't take on g3, he left his knight around there. He played king b8, b6 though, and here actually black felt the position was hopeless. He resigned here, going, yeah, he resigned this position. So he's like 4-0 down now in the 6-game match. Let's have a look at this final position. Why would he resign here? Well, I think this idea still stands. The knight's not doing anything, it seems. The knight's pretty helpless to these connected passed pawns. Say knight f6, a6, we've got the same idea, or nearly. I think maybe b7's not quite accurate. We don't want to play b7 here. But much stronger is apparently a7. And the knight's not doing anything that useful. And actually we could probably pursue these pawns over here. Or we can either win with these pawns or this way, king c8 for b7 and queening. Yeah, so black's totally overloaded. It's a classic endgame. The whole thing, it's the classic endgame. I think one of my good friends on YouTube that got me into doing YouTube videos, Majnu 2006, I think he's got an excellent video on this endgame as well. I think I seem to remember some of the ideas, so as well, check that out as well. Majnu's got a Fischer Taimanov this looking at this endgame, but it was pretty masterful. If you look at from the small advantage in the endgame of the bishop versus the knight, we could make some generalizations here and take away some ideas that holes could be good, for the king, to go into holes, and the bishop is good for hanging around attacking, and that basic plan, puts black under immense pressure in this endgame, a huge pressure, but a tactic was needed to finish it all off, even though we had huge pressure and this lovely rerouting maneuver, so getting that a6 square for even more pressure, but it still needed a tactic to finish black off, an ingenious tactic in the form of bishop takes g6. So it was like positional play, tying black down on both sides of the board, then uncorking this amazing tactic bishop takes g6, knowing that the two connected passed pawns would triumph over the knight. But even then, very delicate, precise play after to make sure that no fortress has been set up. Very precise, king b6. So a masterpiece in the endgame here. I think the earlier part of the game wasn't so interesting. I mean, it was a Taimanov variation after the name Taimanov, Mark Taimanov, but all pretty standard stuff here actually. By the way, you might wonder about f3 not being so accurate, just from those interested in the opening theory. If we take on here, I think the point is there might be queen takes c5 check. Because it's with check, black might be able to get away with this position. King e7, that might be okay here. It's very different structurally, but black might be okay. So it seems more trendy after bishop g4 to not play f3. It's only 7 games in live, but bishop takes c5 seems to be the accurate way to force d takes c. From an opening theory perspective, that looks unusual because you're getting rid of black's backwards d6 pawn, but there's other advantages in the position to try and exploit, as we saw. White's getting this light square bishop against the knight, and a fantastic demonstration here. This is a slight interesting point that c4 also seems to have some winning prospects, but this way of simplifying the game, to this endgame, Fischer maybe is confident in his endgame grinding skills, so he's slowly tying black down on both sides of the board. It's very impressive positioning. I hope you got something from that. I think that was a good revision, for me as well. I really quite liked that endgame. If you can tie the opponent down on both sides of the board, make steady pressure with your king, that's very impressive stuff, to take a small advantage from an opening and turn it into a win. Okay, that's been an out. We'll do 2 games carefully next week. I don't want to do them too quickly, so 2 games at a time for these high level games. I think this was a classic, and I hope you got something from both games this week. So the other game, had that hanging knight on g5. Seemed to be a bit of preparation, just refuted over the board by Fischer in that other game we saw earlier. But this was more for the positional, for the endgame enthusiasts, this particular game. I think you'll get some delight from that. So, that was very, very interesting. Okay, so have a good week. See you next week. Okay, thanks very much. Comments or questions on YouTube when I upload it. Thanks again.